So it's a pleasure for me to welcome and introduce Ray Cleary for our conversation this afternoon. Ray is an Anglican priest. He's Canon Emeritus of St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne. He's been the CEO of the Melbourne City Mission. He's chaired the Public Affairs Commission of the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Australia. He's also chaired the Social Responsibilities Committee of the Diocese of Melbourne, as well as Anglicare Australia. He was the CEO of Anglicare Victoria from 2000 to 2010, and he's currently an adjunct faculty member at Trinity College Theological School in Melbourne. So Ray, thank you so much for being with us and giving up some of your time this evening.
Pleasure, Jeremy, pleasure, delighted.
Earlier this week, actually, on the 24th of March was the day when Oscar Romero was remembered in the calendar. And so it's not a bad thing that we're meeting just a few days after that. And I wanted to begin by sharing a slightly longer version of the quote that you include right at the beginning of the book. He wrote, "A church that doesn't provoke any crisis, a gospel that doesn't unsettle, a word of God that doesn't get under anyone's skin, a word of God that doesn't touch the real sin of the society in which it is being preached. What kind of gospel is that? Very nice, pious considerations that don't bother anyone. That's the way many of us would like preaching to be. Those preachers who avoid every thorny matter so as not to be harassed, so as not to have conflicts and difficulties, do not light up the world they live in." And I thought, we were chatting earlier about one of the joys of being semi-retired is, perhaps now you have a freedom that you may not have had in some of your roles to provoke in a way that perhaps you would have liked to in the past. And so it's terrific that you've captured some of that in your book. But I wanted to begin by going back a little way. In the introduction to the book, you say that you weren't a cradle Anglican and that you really connected with the Anglican Church in your mid-teens in a parish where social justice, outreach to the community, and beautiful worship all went hand in hand together. And I wonder if you could start by perhaps telling us a bit more about that experience and that discovery and what it was about that made sense to you as a teenager.
Well, that's a very good question, and one that I've reflected on often. Before I joined the Anglican Church, I did go to the Church of Christ on a Sunday. A neighbour across the road asked my parents, could she take me to church? And they said yes. They weren't churchgoers at all. And it surprises a lot of my friends that I used to get 100% for Bible study each year at that church. But I outgrew it very much, and it was the Anglican Church across the road, which had a basketball group and a youth group, and so I gradually moved across. And I was quite, I think, moved by the worship to start with, moved by and inspired by it. I think the music was beautiful. It was in the days of a priest called Lyle McIntyre, and Lyle McIntyre was quite controversial in Melbourne. He used to go to the pub every night in his black cassock and beretta at 5:30 and have drinks with the men. So he was a really courageous community person. And when I met him, I suppose in some sense he became a bit of a figure. And then I was invited to become a server and participate in the worship. And I just found it gave me an alternative view of the world than what I had at home. That's not to say my home wasn't loving and all those sorts of things, but it was totally irreligious, had no sense of religion at all. and I found the whole experience, you could say, initially a bit of theatre that embraced me. But then along came another priest, a guy called Albert Smith, who was in Bundaberg. He retired there. He was fairly controversial too, because he used to say what he thought, and that upset a few people. But he opened the scriptures to me. He actually showed me how to read the scriptures and to understand the scriptures. And that, in a sense, gave me a background to the theatre bit. I could then begin to understand what was happening. And so that's where my journey started.
And do you think, that sort of Anglo-Catholic model of church that was deeply connected to community seems to be something that is harder to find these days, and that parts of the Anglo-Catholic tradition have become absorbed in fine liturgy, but sometimes become disconnected from the community they find themselves in. So, despite all of that, and despite the failures that you write about at length in the book, what's kept you? You've stayed when plenty of people have wandered away. So what is it that's kept you as part of the church?
That's a very good question too, Jeremy, and one that I ponder from time to time. But I think it's not the institution that holds me, I don't think. I think it's the narrative that holds me to an expression that the Anglican Church I have always understood as being a middle way in a whole range of situations. And in the parish that I grew up in, it was very much the centre of local community life in many different ways, which I think is one of the challenges that the Anglo-Catholic parishes face today, because there are so many other organisations doing what the church was once the only organisation provided. And so I think the narrative of the life, death and ministry of Jesus, to me, provides a sort of an understanding of the purpose and meaning of life and what it means to be human and to be created in the image of God. I'm not a person of who just despises the institution. I think the institution has a place, but I think in the 21st century we need to reframe and rethink that in a way that relates more fully to the context in which we live. And we don't live in the 1st, 2nd or 3rd century. We don't live in the century in which the scriptures were put together. And I wonder whether the canon of scripture, if we were starting again today, whether we would have a different set of books and a different set of understandings. And I think my understanding of God has certainly grown and shifted and changed throughout my ministry and life. There's no doubt about that. And the God I worship today is very different to the God I understood even in my adolescent years, and so forth. So I think that's something that holds me. My regular liturgical reading and other readings and theology and so forth. I specifically like the writings of Richard Holloway, because in many ways I see myself sitting somewhere in some of the situations that he's been into and where he is now. And I don't think that as we move, whether as priest or lay person, I think unless we grow in our faith journey, then we are diminishing ourselves in terms of our relationship with God.
We talked just before about the huge number of buildings we have, and the fact they're a great blessing, but they also offer us plenty of challenges. You talk about, the church is very different now to what it was when you first fell in love with it all those years ago. And perhaps if we were putting together a canon of scriptures, it would look different. How do you think the church could be different? If we were starting again in the 21st century, what might it look like?
Well, in some ways, I think historically, if you look back at the beginning of churches, we didn't build church buildings. I mean, we met in homes and fellowship and so forth. And one of the things that I'd advocated in the diocesan council here, not successfully, but I did advocate, is that we actually shouldn't be building new churches in outer suburbs. What we ought to be doing is renting space, leasing space in places where people gather. And where do people gather now? Well, they don't gather in churches, they gather in shopping centres or they gather near sporting arenas. And we need to be actually visually in the places where people can see where we are, um, and are accustomed to going by and passing. And so one of our churches that we built in the outer suburbs of Melbourne cost us, I think, $5.5 million to build a church. We had to buy enough space to park 100 cars. That's what the council required. We would have been far more effective to have actually leased some space, created a parish community. And then as communities move, then you can move the church, in a sense, to a new space. And, you know, what we struggle with here in Melbourne, and I suspect in parts of Brisbane too, is that we have churches in places that there are no longer anybody living there. You know, they've moved, they've gone, and it's become industrial, and so forth. So, and you've got a fragment of a congregation who continue to worship there. I mean, I know it's their special place and has been there for their life, but in fact, it's actually restricting us from expanding into other areas where we need to be located. So that's one sort of example that I think is one way that we need to respond. The second way that I often Zoom in or whatever it is, web into Trinity in New York, because they have regular sessions and series and all sorts of discussions about amazing things in terms of faith. And I think we've got to become much more efficient at using technology, because that's what young people use. That's not to say they don't gather, but they also use it extensively. And I think that means we need to invest more heavily in media and IT and find new ways of connecting into people, which we did a little bit, at least in the parishes I've been in, during the pandemic.
It was a fascinating thing during the pandemic. At one level, it showed us how lightly we can sit with our buildings. You know, that to use that great word. You know, we pivoted very quickly to an online space, but it seems to me that we moved very quickly back to where we'd been before. And so, what is it, do you think, that holds people back from experimenting with new ways of being church?
Well, I think one of the big challenges in particularly using technology is to ask ourselves the question: what do we mean by community? And I think community by technology is not what I understand as community. It's one aspect of community, but I think community ultimately means sitting by side, being with people, engaging socially, sharing resources, all those sorts of things. And I think that's one of the things, I suppose, when I think more about my early years in the church, it was that sense of community around the parish that I was there that was really exciting and enriching. Young people of all ages, older people. And I think we must have been one of the first parishes that used to have cardboard wine at, that cardboard box stuff, wine at parish lunches and so forth, and drank porphyry pearl and all sorts of terrible stuff. But hospitality was a very key element of it. And I don't see how you can express hospitality too well on IT. Not at this stage. Perhaps sometime in the future we may be able to. And I think, face-to-face hospitality is very important. So I wouldn't be advocating that we just do IT. I think IT is an adjunct to what else we do. And what I'm finding at the moment is that the IT is useful during the week in the evenings, because I can run a Lenten study for 15 people who come in by Zoom at 7:30 at night, but they won't come to a meeting at 7:30 at night in the church because they've just got home at 6 o'clock or 5:30 and they're not coming out again. So there are ways in which it can be utilised as an adjunct to the community gathering.
And I think it was a couple of years ago, there was a national loneliness study that said that 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 people in Australia experience profound loneliness, at some time. And so you're suggesting that sense of community that is part of who we are, it actually has something incredibly important to offer into that space.
Yes, and I think that during the pandemic that became very obvious. I mean, there wasn't much comment in the media about the way in which churches during the pandemic were reaching out and engaging. But what I found, and there was a lot of it, I can tell you, a lot of it. But what I found intriguing was that suddenly all these social analysts and commentators discovered community and friendship, and that we need to support each other. And I kept thinking to myself, where have you been for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years? And I think we're fast losing it again very quickly, this sense that we have responsibility for each other and we can engage and support each other at a whole range of different levels. So I think that's really an important element in all. And then I think it's one of the elements that, not the primary purpose why we gather as church, but I think it's an important element as to why we gather as church. We gather to worship God, but we gather not as private individuals, but in community, as a shared responsibility. And so, generally I say when I'm presiding at a Eucharist, we are the gathered people of God. We are presiding together, of which I have an official role, if you like. But you are presiding as well, equally as I am.
Mm. I think, I have 3 teenage children, and I think of all the different places where they find that sense of community, and none of those are in the church. And I was intrigued, you said at one point in the book, a terrific quote, to engage in the public forum in the space of ideas is to recognise the disturbing spirit of God, not only in the church, but beyond. That sense that perhaps the Spirit is calling us from outside the church. And it reminded me a bit about something Martin Percy wrote recently, where he said, the church needs to adopt a posture of humility, perhaps for a season. And rather than remain stuck in broadcast mode, we need to spend some time listening. I wonder if you want to just say a bit more about that. What might we learn, or where might we hear the Spirit calling us from outside the church?
Well, one of the things, I suppose, from my personal experience, which drew me into this sort of line of thought, was during my work at Melbourne City Mission and Anglicare, where I got to meet a lot of people who were struggling throughout their life. And just listening to their stories was very revealing to me, because it told me things that I never knew about why they had found themselves in a situation. And one of them was that they had been rejected by the church. Divorcees wanting to remarry, non-church attenders taking their kids to be baptised and being refused baptism. And I thought to myself, God must be somehow trying to engage the world in other ways if our churches are not doing that effectively all the time. That's not to say that they're not, but I think you know what I mean there. The disturbing spirit I see amongst young people at the moment about climate change. I see that as God at work, but where do I see the church in it? I don't. Now, that's not to say individual clergy and people and leaders don't have strong views about that, but the church is not part of the conversation. We're no longer there. Whereas even in my teenage years, and in my first, till the 90s, I suspect, maybe a bit later, the church was always in the conversation. And even during my time at Anglicare, I always found it very interesting when you were dealing with ministers and bureaucrats and so forth who would say to me, oh, we really hear what you're saying. And I'm not just saying this as the CEO of Anglicare, I'm saying this as a leader of the church. Oh, yes. You know, withdraw silence.
And yet it's interesting, recent conversations, at the National Bishops' meeting, we all of the bishops signed a letter calling for an increase in the intake of refugees from Afghanistan. And the commentary we had before that was that there still is a sense from politicians that as a church, we are one institution that still has a presence in even some of the smallest communities. The bank's gone and the school's gone, and yet we're still there.
Yep.
So there's still this sense that we do have a part to play, and if only we could find our voice, perhaps we might be listened to.
I think that's true, Jeremy. And in fact, in 2009, I know it's a few years ago now, time goes faster as you get older, let me tell you, when Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister and we had the first financial crisis, myself, the leader of Uniting Care, the leader of Catholic Care, and so 4 of us met with Kevin Rudd and with the minister at the time and said to them, we need, I think it was $70 million to provide emergency relief. And we got it. Because I think there was this sense that the church and the agencies in particular, were able to deliver what was needed. And I think you're right, there is still a remnant of that still exists. My question to you as a bishop would be, why didn't we in the parishes and the clergy know that the bishops were writing to the Prime Minister? None of us knew until I read it in Eternity and thought, well, hang on, why weren't we all told this? We could have supported it.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And we can talk about that. But I think, what do you think it is that prevents us from doing that? Is it because our confidence has been knocked? We've come through the Royal Commission and we feel there's just a lack of confidence or courage, or what is it that stops us, do you think?
Look, I think it is a lack of confidence after the Royal Commission. I don't think it's exclusively that. I think it may have to do also with a no criticism of any individual person, but what do we require of our leaders? What are the expectations of those who are perhaps ordained to the episcopate? Or why don't we use the leadership in Anglicare and the Brotherhood more extensively on the matters that affect everyday life? Because that's where the resources are and that's where the expertise is in many ways. And I found when I chaired the Church's Public Affairs Commission and we prepared for one election, I can't remember, a booklet with 28 policy areas where we were making recommendations. And I think only 2 bishops used it. And I then resigned from the public affairs. What's the point of this? In frustration. But I think we don't use the many resources that we have at our disposal. We don't know how to use them. There's a guy down here in Melbourne, Stephen Duckett. You may have read some of his material. He's a parishioner and church warden at St Peter's Eastern Hill. And he's a medico researcher. He established Medicare back in 1974, 75, writes regularly about the health system. Why don't we use Stephen Duckett? Why don't we use the skills and talents he's got? Why confine it to the episcopate? That's that's part of, I think, the reforms that we need to do. We need to recognise that we are all given different skills and talents. and we're not living in feudal England. We're living in, multicultural Australia.
And how much do you think it is that we're distracted by our own internal arguments?
All
You
the
know,
time. All the time.
yeah. My children despair at the stuff that, I talk to them about what we spent most of the time at the bishops' meeting talking about, and they throw up their hands. And for them, it just reinforces the reasons why we're largely irrelevant, because we're not speaking into the world that they're a part of.
One of my 3 children still goes to church with his family. My daughter goes occasionally, Christmas and Easter, and my son, who lives in London, has converted to Judaism. So I've got a fascinating experience. But the son who is involved in the church, I said to him a few years ago about the debate about sexuality, and he said, "Oh, Dad, just get over it, will you? Get over it."
But in a sense, there's that great quote in your book from Bishop Bergman from nearly 100 years ago. And he says, it's the business of the church to minister to sick and neurotic souls, yet it ends up far too often with these fearful neurotic souls in the saddle so far as the institution's concerned. So, has anything changed?
Well, he was known as the Red Bishop at the time, and he had he was not what you call one of the clan of the bishops. He was a little bit more outspoken. And look, we did have our Geoffrey Samble here in Melbourne, who did that for many years, Peter Hollingworth, until he became Governor General and Archbishop of Brisbane. But, I think there was more freedom, and I think for some reason there seems to be a closed shop when it comes to actually individual bishops speaking out on things, particularly if they're diocesan bishops. Either fear, they're going to be ticked off, or all sorts of reasons. And I think, as you read that piece from Oscar Romero at the beginning, the church is to be on the cutting edges, I think, of society, or as Walter Brueggemann says, yes, we are in exile, but that exile doesn't mean we remain quiet. It actually means we should be regrouping and repositioning ourselves in new ways to spread the gospel and to promote what we understand of being created in the image of God. And the two key commandments to me are to love God and to love your neighbour. And you can't do one without the other.
Do you think one of the things that curbs our, that prophetic edge is the model that we're locked into? I think of so many of our parishes that are marginal financially, and the fear of losing someone because they don't like being challenged in a particular area, keeps us quiet. I remember when I was an assistant curate in North Adelaide, and on the way out one morning, one of the biggest givers in the parish said, "If you talk about Aboriginal issues one more time, I'm never coming back." And my training rector had a stern conversation with me in the rectory afterwards, and made it very clear that it wasn't my job to chase away parishioners. But do you think it is some of those things about this model that we have, and that's tied up in buildings and finances and all sorts of things, that prevents us being more prophetic in that space? Or is it about how we are prophetic?
Well, I think there's a question behind that for me, and that would be, over the years, how have we journeyed with our congregations and communities about what is essential to our understanding of our discipleship? And what does discipleship mean? And discipleship means, I think, for the other, not for ourselves. So therefore, I think people, particularly perhaps in the Anglican Church, I don't know, but in other traditions, but we've made people feel relatively comfortable rather than actually challenging them in the old more Catholic tradition, like in the east part of London and so forth, where they were on the streets. I think one of the greatest examples of ministry is that wonderful show on television about the nuns. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. The Midwife, which I think is just, it exemplifies in many ways what I understand to be church, what church ought to be. And that we need to be out there constantly on the road, on the journey with people in different ways. And I mean, I've had a similar experience when I was in a parish in Melbourne, and I spoke about poverty on a couple of occasions. And then one woman came up to me after the service and she said, "Ray, you just don't understand how tough it is for us." Oh, I said, "Okay, explain to me." Well, she said, "I've got 2 kids at private school. We've got our holiday house to maintain down at Rye, etc., etc." And I said, "I'm not sure I don't get it. I think you don't get it. That's the thing." And she stopped coming. Well, I'm not prepared to give up what I think is the essential teachings of the church and Jesus in particular for the purity of an individual. They need to come to grips with that issue themselves. It's their problem, not mine. Now, that's not a popular view, I have to say. It's got me into a lot of trouble in the diocese from time to time because I tend to name the elephants in the room that people won't speak about.
So whereabouts do you see hope? As you look at the church broadly, not just in Melbourne, but around the world and wherever, where do you see signs of hope in that sense of the church either having the courage or the presence of mind or the capacity to speak fearlessly into some of these conversations?
I do have hope that it will occur. And I think it's going to come from lay people. It's not going to come from clergy. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that I was inspired to write this not by anything else but lay people in various congregations. I led a series of seminars out in Heidelberg, Ivanhoe for the Council of Churches, and it tended to attract as many non-Christians as it did Christians. And in a way, I think that what I'm hearing as I move around our churches here in Melbourne in different ways is that the local communities, local parish communities, are very dissatisfied and unhappy. And they want some signs that their leadership is going to be vigorous and challenging, taking risks. And if they don't, I suspect many people in parishes will take risks and start doing things. And the challenge will be then, how do we, maintain and keep some order about that? I also see that, sadly, not in the so much in the Catholic churches, Anglican Catholic churches here in Melbourne, but in what I called liberated evangelical churches, and I'm not talking about the narrow Sydney positions or anything like that. They are willing to sort of go out into the communities and into the byways and begin to speak and engage. Fearless, younger people. And I'm not necessarily saying I agree with everything they're moving, but they're prepared to take risks and they're prepared to step out. And I think in the more Catholic tradition here in Melbourne, yes, there are 1 or 2 parishes that I think are doing interesting and exciting things, but many others are just simply caught up in liturgical ritual and seem to be quite comforted by it.
Well, Ray, thank you. We've got time for some questions, and there's a question from Judith that probably from your time with Anglicare is something that exercised your mind constantly. But Judith, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering about the quite considerable amount of money that comes from government funding, particularly in aged care and the like. And what I understand to be increasing restrictions on speaking out if one is in receipt of that sort of funding. And is that having perhaps even an effect overall in the church on our, I guess, our courage really to speak out? You talk about Anglicare being in a great position to make comment, and I'm sure that's right. And I've certainly seen some evidence of that, particularly in Melbourne, I think, with Paul McDonald making comment about foster care and so forth and out-of-home care. But yeah, I'm just wondering if that actually dampens us.
From my experience, it doesn't.
Okay.
In fact, in many ways, I could share some examples, but I won't because it's probably breaking confidentiality, where I've had bureaucrats ring me and say, Ray, will you make a statement about this or say something about that? Because they're as frustrated about a certain policy or issue as anybody else is. And they're more, protected from actually speaking out. They're not allowed to at all. I never found, in my own experience, anyone ever telling me to shut up or be quiet or you can't do that. I think that the danger that, what has happened in one sense since my time is that for some reason, the two reasons. One is, I think many of our church agencies, not necessarily the Anglican ones, are no longer led by people of faith. They're led by what I call managers.
Yeah.
Managers of welfare systems. And so they go for any government contract they can possibly get.
Yeah.
Doesn't align with their mission. I think that's one of the reasons. And I think the second reason is that the demands on the agencies these days are great. When I was working, I did work in aged care many years before I went to the Melbourne City Mission. Again, there was never any restriction on speaking out or talking. And I think that's a furphy that some people hide behind.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Ray, you talk about the fact that in some of our agencies we have really good managers. One of the criticisms of the episcopate is that we're finding managers to be bishops, and what we need are not managers, but bishops with a depth of theological and spiritual depth, really. And you say that one of the ways of addressing the challenge more broadly in terms of the church around being a prophetic voice is theological and biblical education in the church. How do you see that happening?
Well, one of the things that I've been advocating for quite a while is that our theological colleges need to get on board about some of this. That in one sense, I understand the need for academic study and all those sorts of things. But I also think they need to be more proactive in some of the areas that I've written about in the book. Because my experience, and I suppose I learned this a bit at Trinity when I was there for the 5 years teaching, people were coming in who had really no idea about what the mission of the church was. And what I found in Melbourne is they'd only been Anglicans for 12 months and they were being approved for ordination. And I'm thinking, what is going on here? I don't think the theological colleges generally are in touch again with the world in which they're living in. That's not to say they're all like that. So there's that level, but there's also equally the level what I think is at the parish level. We have not been training or educating or informing our congregations in the way that I think we need to. It's not simply about Bible studies. a Bible study that doesn't have issues addressing the major concerns of our day, I think people are finding just tuning out. Now, I ran a series on 5 key issues from Scripture, from a biblical understanding. How do we approach the issue of sexuality? How do we approach the issue of dying with dignity? What are the arguments that we need to think about in terms, is there God? Is there a God? And so forth. 20 to 25 people turn up, because that's where people are at. They don't want, and local communities don't want the church to die. They want it to grow, but they want to know how to grow it. And I think, like any profession, you need teaching. You need to be informed, well informed, and articulate. And I think that's where I find hope amongst congregations who are wanting to do that, wanting to learn. And, as we learned a long time ago, Father doesn't know best all the time.
There's a question from Duncan about schools. Duncan, do you want to?
Hi. So I'm currently based over in England, and I'm really interested in the model that I'm picking up in Australia because I'm coming over later in the year. One of the big concerns I have in England, and one of the things which I've campaigned about as a priest, is the exclusive nature of Christian education in this country. Because even though in England we are the established church and we officially have a law that says that there should be worship in schools, and it really doesn't work like that. The way that it works is by postcode lottery. If you happen to live in a village where there is a church-sponsored primary school, you'll get an ethos that's Christian. But if you don't, you won't. And in the parish which I work in, which is in an urban environment, I have 5 primary schools, one of which is Roman Catholic and 4 of which are secular. What I've done is made a beeline for the secular schools and tried to get a footprint in them over the last 3 years. And what I'm really kind of concerned about is what the model that I'm seeing in as I'm looking at schools for my own child in Australia is one that seems to identify Anglicanism with elite education. The top best schools are Anglican. You want your child to go to that school. But the world that Jesus lived in and the world that we are called to live in is a world that doesn't work like that at all. And I'm really struggling to sort of understand how we can develop our role as church when we seem to have a secular footprint that prioritizes elitism and leadership over everything else. And I guess it feeds into some of the debate about the House of Bishops and the bigger role of the church. Because for me, if we don't get education right, if we don't get our footprint in schools right, if we don't work on our footprint and our relationship with secular environments, then we just become an elitist organisation that caters for itself. And I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on that or response to that.
You're spot on. I agree totally with what you say. Certainly here in Melbourne, our Anglican schools are elite schools. $35,000 a year to attend Melbourne Grammar here or Geelong Grammar. Also, sadly, about 10 years ago, our Christian education in school programs was stuffed up by the Pentecostalists and a couple of others, church groups and narrow evangelicals from our own church, who stuffed up the curriculum and everything in schools. So we're now basically not welcomed in probably 50% of the primary and secondary schools here, which is a great tragedy, because when I taught RE, we call it religious education, not religious instruction. It was broad. It included Christianity, Islam and Judaism as the 3 major Abrahamic faiths. And they were great times, and the kids had great times, and the curriculum at that time was good, but they changed it to this and called it religious instruction in the Christian faith, and really destroyed a lot of goodwill amongst the community. It's another reason, I think, in response to your question earlier, Jeremy, why, you know, we are drifting further and further away from community, because we have no engagement or limited engagement in our secular school system. That's not to say that many of the schools don't want chaplains. They would like to have chaplains. But somehow our leadership in the church doesn't seem to know how to respond to that. I don't know what it's like in Brisbane or elsewhere. I've got no knowledge about that. But here it is a major issue. And if you're coming to Melbourne, I would suggest you go to take your kids to a good state primary school or a good state high school. I went to a high school. I didn't go to a church school. And I have to say, it's been one of the things that's been, I've been criticised by many church people for it, because I chaired a committee on the role of education in the state, where we actually challenged the elite nature of the church schools. The Synod actually passed my report by 5 votes, but nothing ever happened.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Duncan. And as chair of Anglican schools in Southern, I'll take that question on notice, Duncan, and we can chat over a coffee down the track sometime. We've got a few minutes left. I wonder if there's any last question that that anyone has before we wrap up. Well, once again, let me thank you, Ray, for being with us this evening. Thanks, Nikki, also for being here. And you'll see in the chat the link for Coventry Books, and so you can go there and get the book from there. Before we finished, I wanted we started with some words from Oscar Romero, and I wanted to finish with a prayer that's sometimes attributed to Romero, but certainly wasn't written by him, as we finish up. You probably know it. It helps now and then to step back and take the long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it's even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set goals and objectives include everything. This is what we're about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay the foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there's a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and do it well. It may be incomplete, but it's a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that's the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not the master builder, ministers, not messiahs. We are the prophets of a future not our own. So thanks a lot, Ray, for reminding us that we can't do everything, but we need to do something. And that call to prophetic ministry to speak with courage and with clarity into the public space is really central to who we're called to be as the church and who we're called to be as individual Christians. And so I hope that your book will not just be a provocation to people, but also might be a bit of a resource and an encouragement to help people find their voice again and have the courage to raise that voice and contribute to the conversations. So thank you so much for giving some time this evening.